Hi folks, in this video I want to talk about my experience with stereotypy behavior associated with autism. My stereotypy behavior began at a very young age, probably I imagine toddler age, 2 years old anyway, maybe a little bit before that. I would sit and spin the blades on an old box fan when I was a child. I would enjoy doing that for considerable periods of time. I also had a extreme obsession and fascination with driving. I was always fascinated by the lights and buzzers and all that stuff that would come on when you would start the car and different things associated with driving. So that's where my stereotypy started to increase in severity, I guess you could say, because at that point in time I would sit with a steering wheel or something like a steering wheel and sit and pretend I was driving for long periods of time. I would do lots of verbal stimming during that, mimicking the sounds that I'd heard. The stereotypy for me involved a lot of extremely deep and vivid daydreamings. I'm talking about daydreams, virtual reality. I could see it, I could hear it, I could almost reach out and touch it. That's how intense that was. It was a very euphoric experience. For those who may have never experienced an extreme stereotypy, you just wouldn't believe it. It really is a sensation. And eventually my stereotypy carried over into school. Probably at least halfway through second grade into third grade, it really started to get bad. It seemed like to me, for me, the more innovative I got, the more intense the stereotypy got. Now, at school, the stereotypy daydream changed a little bit. Let's start that off. I grew up in a bowling alley as a small child, as a toddler, before I was able to walk. It's almost like I was carried into a bowling alley and mentally never left. I was always fascinated. I liked to bowl. I was always fascinated by bowling and everything associated with bowling, especially the automatic pin setters. And I would always try to sit and figure out what happened to the pins, what happened to the ball, how did the ball get back, how the pins get set back up. I could see enough of it to know it was a machine. Anybody that's been bowling, you know, you can see the machine set the pins up, and you can see it sweep your pins away, but 95% of it you cannot see, and that's the 95% that drove me crazy, because I couldn't see it. So I would sit and use my imagination trying to figure it out. And that's pretty much how the daydream would start. I would start wondering, pondering, trying to figure out how this worked, how that happened. Next thing I know, I'd be in a daydreaming state. So that was mainly the school part of it, with the excessive interest in machines. When I would start my stereotypy, I would use an unsharpened pencil, always an unsharpened pencil. I would put my hands under my desk, lean up against my desk, and twirl that pencil in my hands and go into my trance-like state, or however you want to label it. I think one of the teachers one time said that I would go into trances, daydream, stare off into space, make noises. Stereotypy behavior caused me a lot of trouble in school. Not disciplinary trouble. I never was disciplinary trouble. I didn't cause any trouble. Just trouble as far as my school learning, my academics, classes, things like that. It seemed to me it got much worse in third grade. I started to gain a little bit of control of it once I got to middle school. A very hard thing to control, if not near impossible. You can't really help where your mind wanders to, especially when you're sitting there listening to something you're not interested in, or there's nothing else really going on. Just not sure how to explain how I would have even thought about controlling that at the time. Caused me a lot of trouble in school. I got picked on a lot, teased a lot, because you know, you're sitting there doing something that the other kids aren't doing it. You're the only one sitting there doing that, and kind of sit out like a sore thumb. And now, I've read different stuff on stereotypy behavior. Some say that stereotypy and stemming is interchangeable. I do not agree with that. That statement could not be farther from the truth. Now, I stem too. The regular stemming is different for me than it was the stereotypy behavior. Stemming could be like maybe fixating on a spinning object, fiddling with something, wiggling your fingers in front of your eyes, maybe doing something to visually stem yourself. Now, I will say one thing: I did a lot of verbal stemming. Now, for me, when I started to get into the verbal stemming, I was starting to step into the round of the stereotypy behavior. Uh, and I also read some articles that say autistic people do it just because they like doing it, which is partially true. It is something that I enjoyed. Sometimes I wish I could regain it once in a while because it is an enjoyable, euphoric experience. But when it gets to the point where you're sitting there in the school and you try to pay attention, you try to do right, because I guess any kid that cares anything tries to do right in school. You try to listen, you try to pay attention. That was near impossible for me. Of course, like I said, I enjoyed doing it, but it was more to it than I just enjoyed doing it. It was more of a desire. I guess maybe say like maybe if someone had like a cigarette addiction or something like that, it's the desire to do that thing. That's the same way this stereotypy was for me. I could control it for a while, but not for long, especially in school. And I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's just my interest level in school. But I did it at home too. I would sit by myself and pretend to drive my steering wheel, mimicking all the sounds of driving and things associated with it. So it wasn't just at school. It just very hard thing to explain. I mean, I tried to explain it, but anytime I talk about autism, I'm talking about my personal experience with autism. Autism is different for each person affected by it. But maybe a parent will watch this video and wonder maybe why their child sits, zones out, stares off into space, twiddles their hands. More than likely your child is experiencing a stereotypy, especially if they get into the verbal stemming and zoning out while twirling their hands or something of that nature. That's when you're getting into the stereotypy. I mean, if you have a child that does that, please be patient with them because it's a very hard thing to control. It needs to be controlled or try to, because it can cause you some learning trouble in school. I graduated high school with a regular diploma. I'm not dumb by any means of any stretch of the imagination, but I had some help along the way, and I'm thankful for that help. But as far as controlling the stereotypy, I'm kind of clueless on that one. I mean, I just don't have the answer. What would have helped that? If my stereotypy was interrupted, it did cause me a degree of stress. And if the stereotypy was, I guess, fought off or struggled against, it would eventually come out somewhere else later on. So it never really went away. It never really went away for me. It would come back again. And to this day, I still do a mild form of stereotypy. It comes and goes sometimes. And it's generally euphoric. But I have a lot more control of it now. That's why sometimes I stand against ABA for the stereotypy end of it, because it can be a beast and or like a bully. You know, if every time a bully comes to beat you up, somebody goes chases him off, you never learn to fight the bully. That's something that you are going to have to learn to fight yourself. If you have a child that does stereotypy behavior, he's going to have to learn to fight it himself for the most part. I'm not saying ABA don't work. I'm not saying other methods don't work. I think you should do something to try to help it, at least in the school aspect anyway, just for their learning purposes. But the thing with the stereotypy is you never know what's going on inside their head. They could be doing some serious thinking. My obsession was pin setters. As you can see, I'm sitting behind a pin setter. And that's the nature of the beast. Generally, generally, autistic people have a specific interest. Mine was pin setters. And just to say, a highly fixated interest can be a great benefit later in life. So if your child has a fixated interest that can be of a benefit, I would say feed it. Feed it to the fullest, because it might come in handy one day. This is what, if you can see behind me here, this is what I would try to set and figure out day after day in school. And I've been a pin setter mechanic at a bowling alley for 18 years now. Ironically, I never asked for the job at a bowling alley. Like I said, I grew up in one and walked into a bowling alley one day to bowl and got offered a job. And that's been 18 years ago. That was right after I graduated high school. I was offered a job and took it and fell in love with it. And that's what I do. I guess you could say home is where the heart is. It's not always an enjoyable job. It's like any job, it has its days. Machines don't want to cooperate, things break, and they're not always easy to fix. But autism made me 100% of who I am in every way, shape, and form. I didn't learn to appreciate who I was or my autism until I got a little older. And I guess autism is a very broad spectrum. So, I mean, you got high functioning, you got your Aspies, you got people in the middle of the spectrum, and people on the more severe end of the spectrum. I wish there were a lot more videos out there about this severe end of the spectrum. It seems to be overshadowed by the higher functioning autistic people. If I could do anything for the autism community, it would be to help connect both ends of the spectrum. Because it is my belief, if you could help connect both ends of the spectrum, it would help people understand. Notice I said help. I don't know if we'll ever figure out autism fully, but I think it would help people understand autism on the broad spectrum all the way across the board. I don't know much more to say about this video. I've been tried a couple times to do it. These videos are generally very hard for me. I try multiple times before I get it right. I get tongue-tied, leave things out. So, y'all forgive me for that. And like I said, keep in mind, autism is a very broad spectrum. It's different for each person affected by it. When I talk about autism, I'm generally talking about my personal experience with autism. So let's just keep that in mind. Autism is not a one-size-fits-all. Thank you for watching.